Now, the first in a new 12-part series, The Nuclear Age.
Summer of 1945, an atomic explosion brighter than 1,000 suns heralded the dawn of the nuclear age. The world would never be the same again.
Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union.
The world applauded as Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF Arms Reduction Treaty in 1987. It was seen as the start of a new era of détente between the nuclear superpowers. For the first time in a generation, a gleam of hope shone through the wall of fear created by the nuclear arms race. An occasion for euphoria after years of post-war suspicion and the growing threat of global annihilation. Today, the borders of the superpowers and their allies bristle with radar. Scores of early warning satellites fill the skies. All of it because today the United States and the Soviet Union can destroy each other in less than an hour. The military are on constant alert, listening, watching and monitoring each other. If war comes, the superpowers could call on some 50,000 nuclear warheads. About 2.5 tons of TNT for every man, woman and child on the planet. Many are carried by intercontinental missiles fired from underground, dropped from long and short-range bombers stationed at air bases around the world. And wherever ships of the American and Soviet navies go, nuclear weapons go with them. All the while watching and waiting, ready for the day when, in spite of all reason, deterrence fails. Since the start of the nuclear age, the superpowers have relied on the terror of nuclear war to keep the peace. This was the beginning. The autumn of 1933, and a ship bearing Soviet Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov steamed into New York Harbor. Diplomatic relations between Washington and Moscow were being reinstated for the first time since the Communist Revolution of 1917.
Are you glad to be in America?
I am delighted to be in America.
Oh, fine. Let's stay though.
Yes, yes, I'm glad. Yes, very glad, very glad. I'm delighted.
The two nations that would become the main antagonists in the nuclear age were attempting to overcome profound distrust based on a conflict of ideology.
President Roosevelt, speaking at the Savannah, Georgia bicentennial, summarizes the meaning of the Russian-American agreement.
And I believe sincerely that the most impelling motive that has lain behind the conversations which were successfully concluded yesterday between Russia and the United States was the desire of both countries for peace, the desire for the strengthening of the peaceful purpose of the civilized world.
The two countries were being drawn together in part by a rising tide of militarism around the globe. In Italy, Mussolini and the fascists seemed bent on recreating the Roman Empire. In Japan, the emperor and his warlords were determined to control the Pacific region and expel all Western influence. In Germany, Hitler and the Nazi Party preached the twin doctrines of territorial expansion and racial hatred.
Das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist.
That hatred was to have an unintended impact on the course of nuclear history. Thousands of Jewish intellectuals fled from Nazi persecution. Among them was Albert Einstein, the brilliant physicist and pacifist who would, ironically, become linked to the development of the atomic bomb. He emigrated to America in 1933. Dozens of European atomic scientists followed Einstein's lead. Despite the political upheaval, scientists were making great progress in atomic physics. They, above all, were pressing hard for discoveries that would excite the world of science and revolutionize the world of politics.
It was really from the scientific point of view, an extremely exciting time. I mean, suddenly we began to understand the structure of atoms and the structure of matter, which was completely unknown before, and there are new theories, new ideas, which are very different from the old ideas. It was a revolution in science, and so it was very exciting for everybody. But let me add, you know, it was very esoteric. We did not think at all that this business will have any direct connection with politics or with humanity, with the life of humanity.
Early in 1939, Danish physicist Niels Bohr brought news that would profoundly change the run of nuclear research. A year earlier, in Nazi-controlled Berlin, two German chemists had split the nucleus of a uranium atom by bombarding it with neutrons. The nucleus had been thought to be impenetrable, held together by extremely strong forces. But if it could be split in two, this powerful binding energy would be released as an atomic explosion.
During the process of fission, two neutrons, or approximately two extra neutrons, were emitted. And it became very clear that it might be possible, by utilizing, let's say, one of these neutrons to cause another fission, get another two neutrons, and so on, that you could build up the process so as to release a very large amount of energy, starting out with just one single neutron.
If you could make it go, you could convert this energy into power and make power reactors. And if you were able to make the chain reaction go very quickly, then you would get an explosion.
And then it was clear to us that this is a potential weapon.
In the same year that German scientists split the atom, German troops marched into Austria and Czechoslovakia. Prime Minister Chamberlain, in an effort to avoid war, signed an agreement with Hitler allowing the Nazi takeover of Czechoslovakia to go unchallenged.
The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace.
But Chamberlain's agreement with Hitler was only a prelude to World War. In that fateful autumn of 1938, Chamberlain's soft line merely made the Nazis even more aggressive. In the nuclear age, appeasement such as this would come to haunt the major international negotiations. But the Soviet Union was also eager to avoid war with Hitler. Fearful of attack on their western flank, the Soviets signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis in August 1939. Moscow's alignment with Hitler fueled the ever-present distrust of communism amongst ordinary Americans.
The alignment between Nazi Bolshevism and Soviet fascism is just what the world should have expected. Both are ruthless dictatorships founded on hatred and maintained by force and fear.
The United States wanted nothing to do with the conflict in Europe. But while most Americans went about their business, the atomic physicist Leo Szilard was consumed with Hitler's ever-increasing power. Szilard, a refugee from Hungary, was concerned that physicists in Nazi Germany would try to build an atomic bomb. Albert Einstein lent his prestigious name to a letter Szilard wrote to President Roosevelt. He outlined the theory of an atomic bomb and said that Germany was already stockpiling uranium. The key piece of evidence was that the son of a high-ranking Nazi official was the prominent physicist Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker.
In the letter of Einstein to President Roosevelt, my name is mentioned. And it is mentioned because Szilard knew me, or he knew my name. He didn't know me personally. And my father was a high-ranking diplomat. He was in the German Foreign Office at that time. And it looked quite plausible that if I told my father we can make a bomb, my father might have told Hitler, and Hitler would have said, well, just go on, do it.
On September the 1st, 1939, only 9 months after the discovery of atomic fission in Berlin, the Nazis invaded Poland in a massive assault. Appeasement had failed. Britain and France declared war on Germany. Then, 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, as they had secretly agreed in their pact with the Nazis. The United States, keen to stand apart, continued to stay neutral. The search for the atomic secret became a priority. In Britain, at Birmingham University, 2 émigré physicists were making great strides. They believed that a bomb might be made using a small quantity of an extremely rare isotope of uranium called U-235. Physicist Rudolf Piles concluded that by using this isotope, bombs could be made small enough to be delivered by airplane.
We wrote a memorandum and sent it to the appropriate authorities. And apart from making the technical case for believing our conclusions, we also said in this memorandum that owing to the spreading of radioactive substances with the wind, the bomb could probably not be used without killing large numbers of civilians. And this may make it unsuitable as a weapon for use by this country, meaning Great Britain. We pointed out, however, that it was still essential to have it as a deterrent against Hitler's Germany maybe having this weapon.
The Soviets, too, were exploring atomic physics. Research was being pursued by physicist Igor Kurchatov and Peter Kapitsa.
In those days, it was recognized that there is a possibility of using the nuclear energy for military purposes, for power. In very general terms, the Soviet government was alerted by Soviet scientists on these matters.
In June 1941, Soviet research was abruptly halted when the Nazis suddenly attacked Russia despite Hitler's pact with Stalin. Badly shaken, Stalin broadcast a dramatic appeal to the Soviet people to unite in defense of the motherland.
Граждане, братья
и сестры, вероломные военные нападения гитлеровской Германии продолжается.
Stalin tried to rally a nation ravaged by a decade of bloody purges. Soviet physicists were put to work as part of a desperate defense effort.
In the Soviet Union, in the initial years of the war, the main point was to fight the Germans with ordinary means, and the resources that we had, the scientific resources, were used for other purposes. In fact, Alexandrov and Kurchatov, they were more in charge of demagnetizing ships rather than pursuing nuclear physics.
Hitler's surprise invasion had a lasting impact on Soviet thinking. The speed of Hitler's advance made the Soviets determined to control Eastern Europe when the war was over. This determination would have profound effect on the politics of the post-war nuclear world. But more immediately, Nazi advances posed a stark challenge. A challenge that was pushing the Soviets into an alliance of convenience with Britain and other Western powers.
Churchill, being the man he was, who took big decisions, I think within less than 24 hours, he'd gone on the air with a great speech welcoming the Russians as the victims of Nazi aggression. I mean, that's how he put it, and as our allies in the war against Hitler. Of course, he said privately, I think, that if Hitler invaded hell, he wouldn't mind having the devil as an ally.
Churchill was also asking the United States for increased aid for the war effort. Roosevelt, under great domestic pressure to stay out of the war, had maneuvered the United States into becoming the arsenal of democracy, sending endless war supplies to Britain.
TNT from Tennessee, one of the most powerful high explosives known. Boxes and boxes of it, destined to fill the bombs and shells with which to smash that dictator and all his works. Tommy guns from Trenton, cannon from Connecticut, and bombs from Boston. Great big, beautiful bombs for hitting Hitler where it hurts most.
Britain and the United States also began to share the results of uranium fission research. Their scientists had convinced both governments that an atomic bomb was buildable within 2 to 4 years. The two countries pledged cooperation in what they saw as a desperate nuclear race against Germany. But soon, America's role was to change dramatically. In December 1941, Japan attacked the United States Navy at Pearl Harbor.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The fear of surprise attack would continue to haunt the United States in the years that followed. In the atomic age, a sudden nuclear strike could destroy an entire nation. Pearl Harbor became a symbol of American vulnerability. The US commitment to isolationism lay dead at the bottom of the Pacific. The United States began to mobilize its forces, and secretly, the race to develop an atomic weapon intensified. Roosevelt put the bomb effort, codenamed the Manhattan Project, into the hands of the Army. The man in charge of the project would be General Leslie Groves. He appointed the brilliant young physicist Robert Oppenheimer to head the scientific team. Many of the best scientists in the country were recruited to work on the project. One of them was physicist Philip Morrison.
One of my friends said, "You must come see me tomorrow. I must talk to you. Don't fail." And I said, "Okay, I'll do that." I knew what he wanted, more or less, but not precisely. So I came to his office behind a guarded door, And he said, you know what we're doing here? And I said, well, of course I have a general idea. He said, well, you probably don't realize we're after bombs. That was the word he said. Bombs. I said, that's further than I thought. Yes, he said, it is much closer than you think. This is the most important thing that a physicist can do. You really ought to come join us. We need you. And I said, give me a few days to think about it. And I went home and I thought about it. And a few weeks later, I was in Chicago.
At Chicago University, the world's first nuclear reactor was built under the direction of Italian refugee physicist Enrico Fermi. The theory that each atomic fission of uranium would lead to another, resulting in a chain reaction, was about to be tested. On December the 2nd, 1942, Fermi was ready. Physicist Bernard Feld watched as the cadmium rods used to control the reaction were withdrawn.
When everything was ready, Fermi had the rods withdrawn one by one, and he was sitting there looking at the counter as the counter started to go up and up. And finally, when all the rods were withdrawn, one could hear the counter go and off scale. And Fermi said, well, I guess that's enough. Put the rods back and let's go to lunch.
While Manhattan Project scientists made great progress in the United States, warfare was changing fundamentally. Axis and Allies alike carried out massive strategic bombing raids. This was total war. Civilians in their cities were seen as legitimate targets. The Nazis bombed London and Rotterdam, killing 90,000 civilians. The Allies bombed Cologne, Hamburg and Dresden. 70,000 died in Dresden alone. The morals of war were changing. With such destruction becoming commonplace, it was just one short step to accepting nuclear weapons as legitimate tools of war. In the Soviet Union, the Red Army heroically battled back from early defeats, which left 300,000 dead in the first few months of fighting, and the Soviet capital in a state of siege. All the while, Stalin urged his allies to open a second front in Europe to take the pressure off the Red Army. But Britain had its hands full at home, and American forces were heavily engaged in the Pacific. For nearly 2 years, the Soviets took the weight of the conflict in Europe. Stalin grew suspicious of Anglo-American motives, while the West publicly heaped praise on its unlikely ally.
We believe in the Russian army. We believe in the skill of the Russian generals. We believe in the equipment of the Russian divisions. And we believe in Stalin's leadership. Yes, in Stalin's leadership.
But the alliance with the Russians did not extend to the atomic bomb project. After the successful chain reaction in Chicago, a small group of scientists and engineers were secretly assembled in Los Alamos, New Mexico. They began work on an atomic weapon under the direction of Robert Oppenheimer. The Army Corps of Engineers built a self-contained city in the desert. The work progressed rapidly, propelled by an ever-present fear that German physicists might be ahead in the race to the bomb.
We worked around the clock 6 days a week and Sundays too, because we felt we were the bottleneck in the manufacture of a weapon which we didn't make first would lead to the loss of the war. And every day we read of the battles in which our friends and colleagues and students and allies were being killed in droves. And here we were, in very pleasant circumstances, living in the mountains, working on physics in a wonderful community, and our job was to try to make a bomb. And if we didn't try our hardest, we were certainly remiss. And we did try very hard.
The technical problems were enormous. Uranium-235 is less than 1% of natural uranium and had to be painstakingly separated out in a giant plant in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The Germans, meanwhile, were producing uranium metal at the rate of 1 ton a month. As the theory of atomic bombs moved from the blackboard in a laboratory towards an actual test, its potential impact on mankind became the passion of Niels Bohr. During visits to Los Alamos, Bohr often spoke to fellow scientists of his hopes for a better world in the future nuclear age.
He said, maybe when this terrible, destructive weapon exists and people are aware of it, they will see that war is no solution. But he said, this can only be done if this new idea is not in the possession of one nation, for example, of the United States. It must be internationalized.
In 1944, Bohr urged that the Soviets be included in the Anglo-American Atomic Alliance. He warned Roosevelt and Churchill that atomic know-how might become one of the greatest boons of mankind or the greatest disaster. But the two leaders didn't trust the Soviets. They signed a secret agreement not to share atomic bomb technology. Niels Bohr was condemned as a potential threat to security. June the 6th, 1944, the Western offensive long awaited by Stalin began with a vengeance. During that eventful summer, Allied troops drove deep into occupied Europe. By August the 22nd, Paris was free. But though Germany was in retreat, there were growing fears that Hitler was planning a devastating response. German scientists had developed highly sophisticated weapons, the V-1 jet-propelled missile and the V-2, a rocket, now raining massive destruction on London. If Germany could build weapons like these, could she not also unlock the secret of the atom bomb?
There came against London, especially the V-1 cruise missile and the V-2 ballistic missile, we knew the Germans had been developing for some time. It had always seemed to me that those devices made very little sense unless they had nuclear warheads. So we felt that their use was preliminary to the first few nuclear warheads bursting in London. In those days, I was so concerned that I listened every day to the BBC on shortwave, not because I so much wanted to hear the news, but because I was anxious to see that London was still existing. I felt someday I would turn on the London frequency, would not be there because half a dozen or 10 bombs had burst in London.
We had every reason to believe that Nazi Germany was hard at work developing nuclear weapons. They had highly competent physicists and a highly competent industrial base.
With Germany close to defeat, the Big Three met at Yalta in February 1945. Stalin knew of the American bomb development through Soviet intelligence. Soviet atomic research had quietly begun 2 years earlier under physicist Kurchatov. Secret atomic bomb programs were now underway in both the Soviet Union and the United States. But Yalta dealt not with the bomb, but with the shape of post-war Europe and the war still raging in the Pacific. Roosevelt secured a promise from Stalin to join the fight against Japan, and Stalin renewed his demands for Soviet control over Eastern Europe.
The settlement in Eastern Europe was the major issue for Stalin, and also for Churchill. But, of course, Roosevelt wasn't so interested in that. He told Stalin that he intended to take the American troops out of Europe within a year or two after the end of the war, which meant that Stalin was going to be left with far and away the biggest army in a completely devastated continent. And they had this theory that if only you treat Uncle Joe like a member of the club, see, one of us, he will eventually behave like a member of the club. And this, of course, was a great mistake because Uncle Joe had his own communist club in which he was the boss and had no particular desire to join our Western club as a country member.
Across from the White House in Lafayette Park, the men, women, and children whom Franklin Roosevelt served so well watch in tearful silence.
Less than 2 months after the Yalta meetings, Roosevelt was dead. The personal ties he had nurtured with Stalin and Churchill died with him. Dead, too, was Roosevelt's intimate knowledge of the course of atomic bomb development. His thoughts about how the bomb might be used during the war and its effect on the post-war world were never shared with his Vice President, Harry Truman. A few hours after he was sworn in, Truman was briefed on the bomb by Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Stimson told Truman that the Manhattan Project would produce a new explosive of almost unbelievable power. But the war in Europe was drawing to a close without the use of that new explosive. In April, Soviet troops advancing from the east met Americans from the west at the Elbe River in Germany. Their alliance of convenience had brought victory. They drank champagne together and danced beneath portraits of Stalin and Roosevelt. For a moment in time, the two nations that would become enemies after the war could celebrate their wartime triumph. By May of 1945, the Nazi threat which had precipitated the frantic race to build an atom bomb was finally crushed. Few had realized until then that the race had not been as close as the Allies had feared.
We knew around the end of 90 that we could not possibly make it. The Americans did not know that we knew, and they did not know that it was so hard, because they could imagine that we might have found an easier way than the Americans had found. And if I'm rightly informed, I think it only dawned slowly to our American colleagues that it was so difficult that the expectation that the Germans would have been able to make it during the war with the, under the conditions of air raids and all the other difficulties, that this was very improbable.
At the Radio Moscow, the Soviet nation proclaims the 9th of May Victory Day.
Soviet citizens who had suffered more than any in the conflict had special reason to rejoice.
It was the day we never forget, you know, that we have a song. It was a day of joy and tears because of the victims of the war, of course. This was just a terrible war for our country. You see, a great part of European Russia was in ruins. Had 20 million dead, millions. It was a terrible war. Americans were happy and not to be in Europe during this time, but behind the ocean.
Safe across that ocean in Los Alamos, the bomb project continued to gain momentum despite Germany's defeat.
After the victory in Europe, after May 8th, we all went out and celebrated for a day. But the next day, right back, working away, because we all wanted to know whether it could be done. And we didn't think, you know, is this trip necessary? We just went right on.
We were almost at the end of our work. We worked for 3 years, almost day and night. You cannot stop. You wouldn't stop. Apart from the fact that we thought, correctly, that this bomb will end a very, very bloody war against the Japanese.
In the Pacific, in mortal combat against a fanatic foe, the Army, the Marines, and the Navy were driving to a finished fight. But the Kamikaze Corps, the Japanese pilots who rode the divine wind to certain suicide and possible devastation of our ships, were taking a heavy toll.
The Japanese fought with a suicidal fury that the Allies could scarcely believe. Now the atomic bomb took on new purpose, to shock the Japanese into surrender. Its use seemed nothing more than a logical extension of old-style strategic bombing.
I think we did not understand the full novelty of our weapon. We thought of it more as continuous still with the old way, because after all, the bombers were destroying a city a day, so to speak, in Japan. They made about 100 raids. And for us, it was just 1 or 2 or 3 more. Yes, they were much cheaper. They were even more terrible, but not by a big factor.
I know I felt that the shock would be the thing that might convince the Japanese that they had lost. They already had. They were licked. But that was not the temperament of the Japanese to quit when you're licked. In other words, you fight to the finish. That has been demonstrated throughout the Japanese war.
In July, Truman sailed for a conference in Potsdam, Germany, as the newest member of the Big Three. The talks would coincide with the long-awaited testing of the atomic bomb in the Alamogordo Desert, 200 miles south of Los Alamos. The physicists in New Mexico were confident the bomb would work. The 5-foot sphere was the culmination of 3 years and $2 billion worth of effort. They wagered on its actual power and were certain they were right in judging that the gadget, as they called it, would not cause the Earth's atmosphere to catch fire. Aboard ship, the talk was of the invasion of Japan, scheduled to begin in the autumn. Troops began to move from Europe to the Pacific. But if the bomb worked, the United States would hold a powerful new hand. Invasion of the Japanese mainland with massive casualties might be avoided. Truman, the newcomer, could negotiate post-war settlements with Stalin from a position of newfound strength.
I was at 10 miles away, base camp, and I'll never forget the sense of heat on the face, as though the noonday sun had appeared across the cold desert morning. To me, that was much more important than the flash or even the rumbling, thunderous sound that came and echoed among the mountains a minute later. The real point was that sense of direct, intimate contact through the warming of the skin. But of course, we were all awed and silenced by the extraordinary power, this thing which we had understood in the numbers, but not in true experience.
Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
For many of the scientists, the successful test stirred a sense of awe and foreboding. But the news from New Mexico came as a great relief to Truman and Churchill meeting at Potsdam. They were concerned that the Red Army's occupation of Eastern Europe would give Stalin leverage in bargaining for post-war influence. But now the West had its own secret leverage. From the moment of the Trinity test, the bomb had assumed a towering influence that it has never lost. At the end of the formal conference session on July the 24th, Truman hinted to Stalin of the bomb's imminent use. He said, "We have a new weapon of unusual destructive force." Stalin merely replied he hoped it would be put to good use against the Japanese. Neither man ventured to pursue the discussion, although the Soviet leader knew full well that Truman was referring to the atomic bomb, as Stalin's interpreter Valentin Berezhkov recalls.
Secretary Stimson and Churchill were watching Stalin's reaction, but Stalin didn't show on his face anything. So they got an idea that he didn't understand what it was about.
На самом деле все получилось как раз наоборот. Он решил переговорить с ученым Курчатовым. Это был всемирно известный ученый большого авторитета. Об ускорении соответствующей нашей работы. И переговорил с ним. Курчатов это указание принял как руководство к действию.
But in the United States, Leo Szilard, the very same scientist who'd lobbied so hard for building the bomb, had serious moral doubts about its use. Why not carry out a demonstration, he argued, so that the bomb's destructive power could be seen by all without dropping it on a civilian population? With the help once again of Einstein, Szilard drafted a letter to the American president urging such a demonstration.
One suggestion was that the Japanese be invited and members of the United Nations be invited to a demonstration in some deserted island in the Pacific. The consensus on that was it would not really be as shocking as you'd want, so to speak.
On the British side, I think there was less discussion of these various alternatives. I think the Prime Minister was quite satisfied and indeed convinced that if this weapon could be developed, it should be used. One must not forget that at the time that the bomb was dropped and the war stopped, the British were poised to invade Malaysia, and the Americans and British and the Allies were poised to invade Japan. And it was calculated at that time that on the American Allied side alone, in the Japanese operation, there might be 1 million casualties.
10,000 miles from Potsdam, an atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy was loaded into the belly of the Enola Gay, a B-29 named after the pilot's mother. In Europe, the war was over, but the Japanese leaders were holding out for acceptable terms, above all to keep their emperor. The Allies refused. On August the 5th, the Enola Gay took off to fly through the night across the Pacific.
8月6日の朝、あれですね、学生の点呼というもの、ちょっと分かりませんですかね、朝の朝礼をいたしましてね。あるいは世界がですね青白く透き通ったような気がしたというのがいいかもしれません。その時もう同時にその爆風でガラスの破片がこの右目に立ち込みましてね、その場で右目を失いました。
10分ぐらい経って、校庭一帯から煙が消えて、ようやく明るくなって気がつきましたけども、私自身10メートルぐらい後方に爆風で吹き飛ばされていました。友人たちも後ろへあるいは右へ左へとみんな吹き飛ばされて校庭のあちこちに倒れておりました。学校は木造ですからぺっしゃんこ。学校の周りの付近の家々が全くありませんし、遠くを眺めてもビルの一部が残っていただけで広島の町が完全になくなってしまったと。
At 8:15 on August the 6th, an explosion equivalent to 13,500 tons of TNT ripped through Hiroshima. 130,000 people died in the bombing of Hiroshima. In the following 5 years, another 100,000 would die from the effects of radiation.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth.
The Enola Gay and its pilot returned to base at Tinian to a hero's welcome. But for the scientists whose tireless efforts had given the military an unprecedented new power, this was a time to reflect on the consequences of their scientific success.
When the aircraft landed and the pilot jumped out, he was met by the commander-in-chief of the Air Corps in the Pacific, who pinned a big medal on his chest as he walked 20 feet away from the airplane, with the clicking of photographers innumerable. So we knew that the new world had been entered in that sense. Of course, these people then naturally went on to a celebration of the event, a large party which lasted for a long time, but most of those Alamos people felt rather the profound responsibility of having destroyed a city. We thought it was an evening to be quiet and reflective. We stayed home, and I remember not going to the party and going to bed early, trying to get some sleep. Another bomb, after all, was to come in a few days' time.
Well, my first reaction to Hiroshima was that was a feeling of pride. This would probably end the war, which we all wanted very, very much. And pride because we had been instrumental in bringing this about. My second reaction came when we saw films which had been taken by an observation plane which flew over Hiroshima a few hours later and which photographed the terrible destruction of the city. We had calculated beforehand how much destruction there would be, but seeing it on the film, seeing it more or less directly, was so much more terrible.
The devastation was terrible. It was also totally different from anything before. One bomb had laid waste an entire city. The second bomb would be of different construction, based on uranium and plutonium. American strategists thought it might take up to 50 atomic bombs to force a Japanese surrender. But whatever the moral qualms, for the airmen on the ground, this was just another present for the Japanese enemy. On August the 9th, 4 days after Hiroshima, this second atomic weapon was dropped on Nagasaki, leaving 70,000 dead and another city devastated.
Our impression is difficult to describe. In some ways, especially when after a few days it was clear that the war was over. In some ways we said, well, we did it. The war is over. The killing of Japanese and Americans has ended, and it's we who did it. And that gave us a great deal of satisfaction. At the same time, we were thinking of these other problems, of Niels Bohr's ideas, at least most of us, some of us, and that showed that actually our work starts. Now we have really to tell the public the real significance of this tremendous weapon.
The Japanese soon surrendered. The Allies had dropped their insistence that the Emperor must go. To Truman and the Western Allies, the atomic bomb had been their savior. But Soviet leaders saw it differently. They viewed the atomic bomb not as a godsend, but as a threat.
At that time, of course, we understood that the main purpose of the nuclear bombardment of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not against the Japanese or even to end the Second World War, but to show the Soviet Union how strong became the United States.
Peace had come at last. To the cheering crowds in Times Square and around the world, a new age, the nuclear age, had dawned. Millions believed that the atomic bomb in American hands would guarantee a future where war would be unthinkable. History had indeed turned a page. But as Niels Bohr had wondered, would atomic know-how be one of the greatest boons of mankind, or someday the author of its greatest disaster?
You can see the next edition of The Nuclear Age at 10:35 p.m. on Monday, the 9th of January.